My name is Judith, and I'm 28 years old. Growing up, I always believed family came first, no matter what sacrifices that meant for me personally. I worked multiple jobs, saved every penny, and always put my younger sister Beverly's needs before my own dreams. But nothing could have prepared me for the moment my mother screamed those devastating words that shattered everything I thought I knew about unconditional love. When I chose to invest my $5,000 inheritance in a $3,600 house instead of funding Beverly's latest wellness retreat, my mother looked me dead in the eye and declared I was dead to them. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please hit that like button if you've ever felt like the family disappointment, and don't forget to subscribe, because this journey of rebuilding more than just a house is going to get intense. I grew up in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio, in what most people would call a typical middle-class family. My parents, Harold and Georgia, worked steady jobs and provided a comfortable life for my sister Beverly and me. But from as early as I can remember, there was an unspoken understanding in our household that Beverly was special, and I was the responsible one who would always be there to support whatever dreams she chased. Beverly is 3 years younger than me, and ever since high school, she's been obsessed with wellness trends and spiritual journeys. First, it was yoga teacher training that cost $2,000. Then it was a meditation retreat in Arizona for $1,500. After that came crystal healing certification aromatherapy courses and a nutrition coaching program. Each time, the family rallied around her latest passion, with my parents contributing what they could, and me working extra shifts at my part-time jobs to help cover the costs. I started working when I was 16, first at a local diner, and then adding a weekend job at a retail store. While Beverly spent her teenage years exploring her spiritual side and attending various workshops, I was saving every dollar I could for what I thought would eventually be college. But somehow, every time I accumulated a decent amount of money, there was always another one of Beverly's ventures that needed funding. My parents made it clear that supporting Beverly was an investment in her future happiness and success. They painted it as temporary help until she found her calling and became financially independent. Georgia would say things like, "Judith, you're so practical and grounded. You'll always land on your feet. But Beverly needs our support to find her path." Harold would nod along, adding that it was important for family to stick together and help each other achieve their dreams. The pattern continued into our 20s. I moved out at 21 and rented a small apartment while working as an administrative assistant at a local insurance company. Beverly bounced between living at home and staying with various spiritual mentors she met during her courses. She'd come home excited about her latest discovery, whether it was sound healing or life coaching, and the family would gather around to hear about her next educational opportunity. Last spring, my grandmother Rose passed away unexpectedly. She was my father's mother, and despite not having much money, she left me $5,000 in her will. I remember sitting in the lawyer's office holding that check and feeling for the first time in years like I might actually have the chance to pursue something for myself. The money felt like a gift, not just financially but emotionally. Grandmother Rose had always encouraged my practical nature and told me I was smart with money. But within days of the will reading, Beverly announced her latest plan. She had discovered a life-changing wellness retreat in Costa Rica that promised to help her finally launch her dream business as a spiritual life coach. The retreat cost $4,000 plus airfare and accommodations. She was absolutely glowing as she described the program, talking about how this would be the final piece she needed to start earning real money, helping others transform their lives. I watched my parents' faces light up with pride and excitement for Beverly's opportunity. Georgia immediately started calculating how the family could come together to make it happen. That's when Harold mentioned my inheritance, suggesting it was perfect timing and that Grandmother Rose would have wanted the money to help the family support each other's dreams. The expectation was never directly stated, but it hung in the air like humidity before a thunderstorm. Everyone assumed I would contribute my inheritance to Beverly's retreat fund. After all, hadn't I always been the one to sacrifice for the family? Wasn't this just another example of how we all work together to help each other succeed? But something felt different this time. Maybe it was grief over losing grandmother Rose. Or maybe it was the exhaustion of years spent working multiple jobs while watching Beverly chase expensive dreams that never seemed to lead to financial independence. For the first time, I found myself wondering what would happen if I used that money for something I wanted instead of something the family expected me to want. It started with a random internet search on my lunch break at work. I had been researching affordable housing options, not because I was seriously considering buying anything, but because I was curious about what $5,000 might accomplish in terms of a down payment. Most of the houses in decent neighborhoods required down payments of $20,000 to $30,000, which put homeownership completely out of reach for someone with my income. But then I stumbled across a listing that made me do a double take. A house in the Riverside neighborhood was listed for $3,600. Not $36,000, not $360,000. $3,600 total. The listing was sparse on details, mentioning only that it was a foreclosure property being sold as is with cash, only transactions accepted. I stared at my computer screen for several minutes, convinced there had to be a mistake. But the more I researched, the more I learned about the reality of abandoned properties in declining neighborhoods. The Riverside area had been hit hard by economic downturns, and many houses sat empty for years, while the city tried to recoup unpaid taxes through auction sales. That evening I called the listing agent, a tired-sounding woman named Margaret, who explained that yes, the price was correct, and yes, the house needed significant work. She warned me that most buyers were either investors looking for rental properties or people planning to demolish the structure for the land. But she agreed to show me the property the following Saturday if I was serious about viewing it. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching my nervous energy as I drove across town to meet Margaret. The Riverside neighborhood looked rough around the edges, with several empty lots where houses used to stand and many properties showing signs of neglect. But there were also signs of life: children playing in yards, neighbors talking across fence lines, and small gardens tucked between homes. The house itself was a small 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom structure with white aluminum siding that had seen better days. Several windows were boarded up, and the front porch sagged slightly on one side. Margaret unlocked the door with some difficulty, and we stepped inside to musty air and the sound of our footsteps echoing on bare floors. But as we walked through the rooms, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: possibility. The bones of the house were solid. The foundation seemed stable, and there were no obvious signs of major structural damage. The electrical panel looked relatively modern, and Margaret mentioned that the plumbing had been updated sometime in the previous decade. The biggest issues seemed to be cosmetic damage, drywall, old flooring, and outdated fixtures. I found myself mentally calculating renovation costs as we toured each room. The kitchen cabinets could be painted instead of replaced. The bathroom needed a new vanity and toilet, but the shower looked functional. The living room had beautiful original hardwood floors underneath layers of old carpet. With some elbow grease and careful budgeting, I could see how this house could become a real home. Margaret seemed surprised by my genuine interest. She explained that most people took one look and walked away focusing on everything that was wrong instead of seeing the potential. But I had spent years watching every penny and learning to fix things myself out of necessity. This house felt like exactly the kind of challenge I could handle. Standing in what would become my bedroom, looking out a window that faced a small backyard with an old oak tree, I made a decision that would change everything. I told Margaret I wanted to make an offer for the full asking price. She looked at me like I might be crazy, but she pulled out the paperwork. The next week was a blur of inspections, paperwork, and arrangements. Because it was a cash sale, the process moved quickly. I had to provide proof of funds and sign dozens of documents. But within 10 days, I was holding the keys to my very own house. The day I closed on the property, I sat in my car outside the house for 20 minutes just staring at it and trying to process that I was now a homeowner. At 28 years old, with a modest income and no family financial support, I had somehow managed to buy a house. It needed work, but it was mine. That evening, I drove to my parents' house for our regular Sunday dinner, my stomach churning with anxiety about revealing my secret purchase. Beverly had been building excitement all week about her Costa Rica retreat, and I knew she was planning to finalize the funding arrangements that night. The family was already gathered around the kitchen table when I arrived. Beverly was practically glowing as she spread brochures and printouts across the surface describing the retreat center's amenities and the transformational workshops she would attend. The program promised to provide all the tools she needed to launch her spiritual coaching business successfully. Georgia was nodding enthusiastically, occasionally reaching out to squeeze Beverly's hand in support. Harold was asking practical questions about the timeline and logistics, but his tone was warm and encouraging. The scene felt familiar, the whole family rallying around Beverly's latest dream while I sat quietly expected to contribute, but not really consulted about my own feelings. Beverly turned to me with sparkling eyes and announced that she had worked out the perfect funding plan. My parents would contribute $1,500 from their savings. She had managed to save $800 from various part-time jobs, and with my $5,000 inheritance, they would have enough to cover the retreat cost plus her airfare and expenses. The expectation in her voice was absolute. She wasn't asking for my contribution. She was simply informing me how my money would be used. Georgia and Harold looked at me expectantly, waiting for my enthusiastic agreement and probably some comment about how proud I was to help Beverly take this important step. Instead, I took a deep breath and said, "Actually, I've already spent the inheritance money." The silence that followed felt like stepping into a vacuum. Beverly's face went from excitement to confusion, while my parents looked at me like I had spoken in a foreign language. Georgia was the first to find her voice. "What do you mean you spent it? Spent it on what?" "I bought a house," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "in the Riverside neighborhood. I closed on it yesterday." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Beverly's face crumpled and she started crying, saying I had ruined her chance at finally building a successful career. Georgia stood up so quickly her chair scraped against the floor, her face flushed with anger. "You bought a house in Riverside. Judith, that neighborhood is falling apart. Those houses are worthless. You threw away your inheritance on some trash property instead of helping your sister build her future." Harold tried to be the voice of reason, asking about the details of the purchase and whether I had considered the long-term implications. But even his questions carried an undertone of disappointment, as if I had made a selfish and foolish decision without considering the family's needs. Beverly was becoming more hysterical, talking about how this retreat was her last chance to make something of herself, and how I had always been jealous of her spiritual journey. She accused me of deliberately sabotaging her opportunity because I couldn't stand to see her succeed. Georgia's anger was building to a crescendo. She called my purchase idiotic and irresponsible, saying I had wasted Grandmother Rose's hard-earned money on a property that would never be worth anything. She demanded to know how I could be so selfish as to prioritize my own wants over my sister's genuine needs. The argument continued for over an hour, with Beverly crying and my parents taking turns expressing their disappointment and frustration. They wanted to know exactly how much I had paid, what condition the house was in, and whether there was any way to reverse the purchase so the money could still go toward Beverly's retreat. When I tried to explain my reasoning, talking about the potential I saw in the property and my desire to build equity instead of paying rent forever, Georgia cut me off with a harsh laugh. "Potential, Judith, you bought a trash house in a dying neighborhood. You'll end up pouring more money into that place than it will ever be worth, and meanwhile, Beverly's chance at success slips away because of your selfishness." The final blow came when I refused to consider taking out a loan to cover Beverly's retreat costs. Georgia's face went cold, and she delivered the words that would echo in my mind for months. "You have disgraced this family. You're dead to us until you find a way to fix this mess you've created." Harold looked uncomfortable with the severity of Georgia's declaration, but he didn't contradict her. Beverly was sobbing, asking how her own sister could care so little about her happiness and future. I gathered my purse and left without another word, my hands shaking as I drove home to my tiny apartment. questioning everything I thought I knew about my family's love. The silence from my family was immediate and complete. Georgia blocked my phone number, and Beverly unfriended me on all social media platforms. Harold didn't contact me directly, but I heard through my cousin Janet that he was disappointed in my choices and thought I should have found a way to help Beverly while still pursuing my own goals. The first few weeks were emotionally devastating. I had never experienced rejection from my family before, and the weight of their disapproval felt crushing. I questioned my decision constantly, wondering if I had been selfish and short-sighted. Maybe they were right about the house being a terrible investment. Maybe I should have prioritized Beverly's retreat and found another way to pursue homeownership later. But as I started actually living in the house, something began to shift in my perspective. I had moved in with just the basics: a mattress on the floor, a small table, 2 chairs, and a few boxes of personal belongings. The house had working electricity and water, though the fixtures were old and the water pressure was weak. I bought a hot plate and a small refrigerator to make the kitchen functional. The quiet was initially unsettling after years of living in apartment complexes with thin walls and noisy neighbors. But gradually, I started to appreciate the peace and the fact that every decision about the space was mine to make. I could paint the walls any color I wanted. I could plan improvements based on my own priorities and timeline. For the first time in my adult life, I was living somewhere that belonged to me. My neighbor to the left, an elderly woman named Dolores, introduced herself during my second week in the house. She brought over a plate of homemade cookies and welcomed me to the neighborhood with genuine warmth. Dolores had lived on the street for 30 years and had watched many families come and go. She was realistic about the neighborhood's challenges, but also deeply invested in its potential for improvement. Dolores became my first friend in Riverside, offering practical advice about everything from which contractors were reliable to where to shop for affordable home improvement supplies. She had renovated her own house gradually over the years and understood the satisfaction that came from transforming a space through your own efforts. I started my renovation journey by watching countless hours of instructional videos online. YouTube became my construction university, teaching me everything from basic electrical work to plumbing repairs. I learned about different types of paint, how to install flooring, and the proper way to patch drywall. Each new skill felt like a small victory. The first major project was addressing the boarded-up windows. I carefully removed the plywood and discovered that most of the windows were intact underneath, just dirty and painted shut from years of neglect. Cleaning them and getting them operational again transformed the interior of the house, filling the rooms with natural light for the first time in years. Next, I tackled the flooring. The carpet throughout the house was stained and musty, but when I pulled it up, I found original hardwood floors that had been hidden for decades. They needed refinishing, but the wood was solid and beautiful. I rented a floor sander and spent a weekend learning how to bring those floors back to life. Each small improvement built my confidence and my vision for what the house could become. I was working with a tight budget, shopping at discount stores and salvage yards for materials. But I was discovering that creativity and persistence could accomplish amazing things even without unlimited funds. The physical work was exhausting, but it was also therapeutic. After years of feeling like I had no control over my life's direction, I was finally taking action to build something that was entirely my own. Every blister on my hands and every aching muscle at the end of the day represented progress toward a goal that no one could take away from me. As spring turned to summer, my renovation project began attracting attention from other neighbors. The man who lived across the street, a retired carpenter named Edwin, started stopping by to offer advice and encouragement. He had been watching me work and was impressed by my determination to learn proper techniques rather than just rushing through projects. Edwin owned a small hardware store in the next neighborhood over, and he began offering me materials at cost, saying he wanted to support someone who was investing in the community's improvement. His generosity made it possible for me to tackle bigger projects like updating the bathroom and improving the kitchen functionality. Word spread through the neighborhood that someone was seriously renovating the old house on Maple Street. People would walk by and comment on the progress, often stopping to chat about their own home improvement experiences. I was building connections with people who understood the satisfaction of working with your hands and creating something beautiful from something neglected. The kitchen renovation became my biggest challenge and my greatest success. The cabinets were structurally sound but covered in layers of old paint and grease. I spent weeks stripping them down to the bare wood, then painting them a fresh white that brightened the entire space. I found a used stainless steel sink at a salvage yard and installed new faucets that actually provided decent water pressure. The bathroom required more extensive work. The old vanity was water damaged and had to be completely replaced. I learned how to install a toilet, which was far more complicated than I had expected, but incredibly satisfying once I got it right. A new vanity from a discount store and some creative tile work around the shower transformed the space from depressing to functional. Summer evenings found me working in the backyard, clearing overgrown weeds and planting a vegetable garden. The soil was better than I had expected, and Dolores shared seeds and starter plants from her own successful garden. There was something deeply satisfying about the idea of growing my own food on my own land. My job at the insurance company was going well too. The confidence I was gaining from successfully managing my renovation project seemed to carry over into my professional life. I was more assertive in meetings, more willing to suggest improvements to existing processes, and generally more engaged with my work. My supervisor noticed the change and began giving me more responsibilities. I started documenting my progress on social media, not to show off, but to keep track of the transformation and share tips with other people undertaking similar projects. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with people commenting on my creativity and determination. For the first time in years, I was receiving praise and recognition for something I had accomplished entirely on my own. The house was beginning to feel like a real home. I had painted the living room a warm yellow that complemented the refinished hardwood floors. The kitchen was functional and bright, and the bathroom was clean and modern. I had even managed to create a cozy bedroom with secondhand furniture that I had refinished myself. But perhaps the most significant change was in how I felt about myself. The woman who had bought this house 8 months earlier had been timid and eager to please, always deferring to other people's opinions and priorities. The woman who was now installing her own light fixtures and planning a kitchen herb garden was confident, capable, and proud of what she could accomplish with determination and hard work. I was learning that there was profound satisfaction in building something with your own hands, in solving problems through research and persistence, and in creating beauty from neglect. Every day brought new challenges, but they were challenges I had chosen for myself rather than problems imposed on me by other people's expectations. In late fall, almost a year after I had bought the house, my cousin Janet called unexpectedly. She started the conversation by saying she had been following my renovation progress on social media and was impressed by what I had accomplished. But the real reason for her call became clear quickly. She was calling on behalf of my parents. Janet explained that Beverly's retreat in Costa Rica had not gone as planned. Without the full funding she had expected, Beverly had borrowed money at high interest rates to cover the costs. The retreat itself had been disappointing, with much of the promised instruction turning out to be basic information Beverly already knew. More significantly, the business launch guidance had been vague and impractical. Beverly had returned from Costa Rica with significant debt and no clearer plan for building her coaching business than she had before leaving. She was living with my parents again, struggling to find steady work and dealing with the stress of loan payments she couldn't afford. Meanwhile, my parents were facing their own financial difficulties. Harold's company had reduced his hours, and Georgia was dealing with some health issues that had led to unexpected medical expenses. The money they had contributed to Beverly's retreat had depleted their emergency savings, leaving them financially vulnerable. Janet was careful in how she shared this information, making it clear that she wasn't trying to make me feel guilty or responsible for the family's problems. But she also hinted that my parents were beginning to question whether they had been too harsh in their reaction to my house purchase. The conversation left me with mixed feelings. Part of me felt vindicated that Beverly's expensive retreat had not been the life-changing opportunity my family had believed it would be. But I also felt sad that the people I loved were struggling, even if their struggles were largely the result of their own financial decisions. A few weeks later, Harold called me directly for the first time since our confrontation at the family dinner. His voice was hesitant, and he spent several minutes asking about my health and my job before getting to the real purpose of his call. He wanted to know if I would be willing to have coffee with him to discuss the family situation. We met at a neutral location, a small cafe halfway between my neighborhood and my parents' house. Harold looked older and more tired than I remembered, and his discomfort was obvious as he struggled to find the right words to begin our conversation. He started by acknowledging that my house renovation had turned out better than anyone in the family had expected. He had driven by the property recently and was surprised by how much the exterior appearance had improved. He asked about the progress I had made inside and seemed genuinely interested in hearing about the projects I had completed. Then he moved to the more difficult topic of our family conflict. Harold admitted that he and Georgia had been so focused on supporting Beverly's dreams that they had failed to consider my own needs and goals. He said they had taken for granted that I would always be willing to sacrifice for the family without questioning whether that expectation was fair. But even as he acknowledged these things, Harold was still hoping I might be willing to help Beverly with her current financial difficulties. He suggested that since my house was now worth more than I had paid for it, I might consider taking out a home equity loan to help Beverly pay off her retreat debts. I listened to his proposal with a mixture of sadness and frustration. Even in this moment of supposed reconciliation, the underlying assumption was still that my resources should be available to solve Beverly's problems. Harold seemed genuinely unable to understand that my house represented security and independence that I was not willing to risk for someone else's poor financial decisions. I explained to Harold that I was not interested in taking on debt to bail Beverly out of a situation she had created for herself. I told him that I loved my family, but I was no longer willing to sacrifice my own financial stability to enable Beverly's impractical choices. Harold's disappointment was visible, but he seemed to recognize that I was not going to change my mind. He asked if I would be open to rebuilding our relationship without the expectation of financial assistance, and I told him I would consider it if the family could accept my boundaries. Winter brought unexpected visitors to my front door. Georgia and Beverly arrived on a cold Saturday morning in February, both looking nervous and uncomfortable as they stood on my newly repaired front porch. I had been refinishing kitchen chairs in my living room when the doorbell rang, and I was covered in sawdust and wearing old clothes. Georgia's first words were about how different the house looked from the outside. The fresh paint, repaired porch, and general upkeep had transformed the property's appearance completely. Beverly was quieter, looking around with what seemed like genuine curiosity about what I had accomplished. I invited them in, suddenly self-conscious about the ongoing renovation projects and the fact that I was clearly in the middle of working. But as we moved through the house, I watched their expressions change from skeptical curiosity to genuine surprise, and eventually something that looked like respect. The living room with its refinished floors and warm paint colors was cozy and inviting. The kitchen, which had been my biggest challenge, was now bright and functional, with its painted cabinets and updated fixtures. The bathroom renovation had created a clean, modern space that looked like it belonged in a much more expensive house. Georgia was clearly struggling with the contrast between what she had expected to find and what she was actually seeing. She made several comments about how much larger the room seemed than she had imagined and how the natural light made everything feel welcoming. Beverly was asking questions about specific renovation techniques and costs. She seemed particularly interested in how I had learned to do the work myself and where I had found affordable materials. Her questions felt genuine rather than judgmental, which was a significant change from our last interaction. As we sat in my living room drinking coffee, Georgia began what seemed like a prepared speech. She acknowledged that she had been wrong about the house and wrong about my decision to purchase it. She admitted that she had let her disappointment about Beverly's situation cloud her judgment about my choices. But the conversation also revealed that the family's financial stress had continued to worsen. Beverly's debt from the retreat was creating ongoing strain, and my parents were struggling to help her while managing their own reduced income and increased expenses. Georgia's apology was accompanied by a new request. She wondered if I might be willing to let Beverly move in with me temporarily, just until she could get back on her feet financially. In exchange, Beverly could help with renovation projects and contribute to household expenses once she found steady work. The request put me in a difficult position. On one hand, I was glad that my family was finally acknowledging that I had made a smart decision about the house. On the other hand, I could see that they were still primarily interested in finding ways for me to solve Beverly's problems. I told them I needed time to think about the living arrangement proposal. I explained that my house had become a sanctuary for me, a place where I could focus on my own goals without the pressure of managing other people's needs and expectations. Beverly spoke up for the first time, saying she understood my hesitation and didn't want to impose on the peace I had clearly found. She admitted that she had been irresponsible with money and had unrealistic expectations about quick fixes for building a successful business. The conversation ended without any firm commitments, but with a sense that we were at least talking to each other again. Georgia and Beverly left with an open invitation to visit again, and I was left to consider whether I was ready to risk the independence I had worked so hard to build. Spring brought the completion of my house renovation project and a perspective on my life that I never could have imagined 2 years earlier. The final major project was landscaping the front yard, creating curb appeal that matched the improvements I had made to the interior. I planted flowers, installed a small fence, and created a welcoming entrance that made the house look like it belonged in a much more expensive neighborhood. A professional appraisal for insurance purposes revealed that my $3,600 investment was now worth over $30,000. The combination of my improvements and the gradual stabilization of the Riverside neighborhood had created equity that gave me financial security for the first time in my adult life. More importantly, the process of renovating the house had revealed capabilities and confidence I never knew I possessed. I had learned practical skills that would serve me for the rest of my life, but I had also discovered that I was much stronger and more resourceful than I had ever believed. My relationship with Dennis, a contractor I had met through Edwin at the hardware store, had grown into something meaningful and supportive. Dennis respected my independence and my skills, often asking for my input on his own projects. He had been there for the frustrating moments when nothing seemed to go right, and he had celebrated the victories when difficult projects finally came together perfectly. The neighborhood itself had become a community in ways I had never experienced before. Dolores and I were planning a shared garden for the upcoming season. Edwin had become like a mentor, teaching me advanced techniques and introducing me to other people in the local construction trades. My house had become a gathering place for neighbors working on their own improvement projects. When I decided to host a housewarming party in May, I realized that I wanted to invite my family alongside the people who had supported me throughout the renovation process. It felt important to show Georgia, Harold, and Beverly that I had built not just a beautiful home, but a life filled with people who valued my contributions and respected my choices. The party was a success beyond my expectations. My neighbors, coworkers, and new friends mingled easily, sharing stories about the transformation they had witnessed and praising the work I had done. Dennis grilled burgers in the backyard, while Dolores showed off the herb garden we had planted together. When my family arrived, they seemed overwhelmed by the warmth and obvious community I had built. Beverly spent a long time talking with Edwin about sustainable renovation techniques, and Georgia found herself in deep conversation with my supervisor from work about my recent promotion to Senior Administrative Coordinator. The most meaningful moment came when Harold pulled me aside to apologize for not understanding my vision from the beginning. He said he could see that buying the house had been about much more than just acquiring property. It had been about building the foundation for the kind of life I wanted to live. Georgia's apology was more difficult for her, but equally important to me. She admitted that she had been so focused on Beverly's needs that she had failed to recognize my own dreams and ambitions. She said she could see now that I had made not just a smart financial decision, but a choice that had allowed me to discover who I really was when I wasn't constantly trying to meet other people's expectations. Beverly and I had a private conversation that evening that finally addressed the years of resentment and misunderstanding between us. She acknowledged that she had become accustomed to having family resources available for her various pursuits without considering the impact on others. She also admitted that seeing what I had accomplished with the house had made her realize she needed to develop more practical skills and realistic financial planning. We talked about the possibility of her moving in with me temporarily, but both of us recognized that she needed to prove to herself that she could be financially responsible before taking on shared living arrangements. Beverly had finally found steady work as a receptionist at a yoga studio, and she was slowly paying down her retreat debts while living with our parents. The party continued late into the evening with people gathered in small groups throughout the house and backyard. I moved between conversations feeling proud, not just of what I had built physically, but of the relationships and community I had created around this little house in Riverside. As I stood in my living room, looking at the refinished floors that I had sanded myself and the walls that I had painted in colors I chose, I realized that the most important thing I had built was not the house itself, but the confidence to trust my own judgment and pursue my own dreams. The journey had cost me temporary relationships with my family, but it had given me something much more valuable: the knowledge that I could take care of myself, solve complex problems, and create beauty and stability through my own efforts. The house had become a symbol of my independence, but more than that, it had become the foundation for a life built on my own terms. Looking back, I could see that every difficult moment had been worth it. The loneliness when my family cut me off had taught me to value people who supported my goals, rather than trying to redirect them. The physical challenges of learning construction skills had shown me that I was capable of much more than I had ever imagined. The financial constraints had forced me to be creative and resourceful in ways that traditional renovation projects never would have required. My family relationships were healing, but they were different now. The dynamic where I automatically sacrificed my own goals for Beverly's latest venture was permanently broken. Instead, we were building connections based on mutual respect and recognition of each other's individual paths. Beverly had learned that sustainable success required patience, practical skills, and realistic financial planning. My parents had learned that their daughters were both capable of making their own decisions and living with the consequences. And I had learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is to refuse to enable their poor choices while demonstrating a better way forward. The house in Riverside had given me more than just homeownership and financial equity. It had given me a sense of belonging both to a physical place and to a community of people who valued hard work, creativity, and mutual support. It had shown me that taking care of myself was not selfish, but necessary for being able to offer genuine help to others when appropriate. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Dennis helped me clean up while sharing his thoughts about how much I had grown since we first met. He had watched me transform from someone who second-guessed every decision to someone who approached challenges with confidence and problem-solving skills. Standing in my kitchen washing dishes in the sink I had installed myself, I felt a deep sense of contentment that had nothing to do with other people's approval. I had built something beautiful and meaningful with my own hands and my own vision. I had created a life that reflected my values and priorities rather than other people's expectations. The $3,600 house had cost me much more than money. It had cost me my old identity as the family member who always said yes, always sacrificed, and never pursued her own dreams. But in return, it had given me a new identity as someone who could envision possibilities, work toward goals, and create beauty from neglect. If you've ever felt like you had to choose between your family's expectations and your own dreams, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Have you ever made a decision that your family didn't understand, but that turned out to be exactly what you needed? Please hit that like button if this story resonated with you, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your own path in life. Share this video with anyone who might need to hear that investing in yourself is never selfish. Thank you for listening to my journey. And remember that sometimes the best foundation you can build is the confidence to trust your own judgment. I hope your own dreams, whatever they may be, lead you to the kind of peace and satisfaction that comes from building a life that truly belongs to you.